June 26th, 1943. 25,000 feet over occupied France. Second Lieutenant Robert Johnson's P-47. Thunderbolt shudders as 21 cannon shells tear through its fuselage. Machine gun bullets, more than 200 of them, perforate the wings, the cockpit, the engine cowling. Hydraulic fluid blinds him. Fire licks at his boots. The canopy shatters into 1,000 pieces of razor-sharp glass. In any other fighter aircraft of World War II, this moment would have meant certain death. The sleek Spitfire, the nimble Mustang, the agile Messerschmitt, all would have disintegrated under such punishment. But Johnson is flying what his fellow pilots mockingly call the flying bathtub, 7 tons of American steel that the experts said would never survive in combat. Too heavy, too slow, too big. As Johnson's crippled Thunderbolt begins its death spiral toward the French countryside, 300 miles from safety, something impossible is about to happen. Something that would rewrite everything the aviation world thought it knew about fighter aircraft design. The bathtub was about to prove it doesn't leak when it's built right. The European Air War of 1940 had established its cruel mathematics with unforgiving precision. Above the chalky cliffs of Dover and the industrial heartland of the Ruhr, speed and agility determined who lived and who died. The Supermarine Spitfire, weighing just 5,280 pounds and capable of 362 miles per hour, had become the gold standard of fighter design. Its elliptical wings could carve through the sky with ballet-like grace, turning inside German Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs that dared challenge British airspace. RAF pilots spoke of their mounts with the reverence typically reserved for thoroughbred racehorses, and they viewed American aviation with barely concealed condescension. When the First Republic P-47 Thunderbolts arrived at British airfields in early 1943, the mockery was immediate and merciless. "You could dodge around inside the fuselage," became the standard British quip about the massive American fighters. Compared to the svelte Spitfire, the P-47 looked like a flying oil drum, 12,086 pounds of brute force engineering that seemed to violate every principle of aerial combat. German pilots, accustomed to the nimble Focke-Wulf 190 and the climbing prowess of the Messerschmitt 109, initially welcomed the sight of American P-47s with dark humor. Here finally was confirmation that American industrial might could not overcome European aviation sophistication. But in a cramped design office at Republic Aviation Corporation on Long Island, Alexander Kartveli had spent 3 years pursuing a radical heresy. Born in Russia and trained in France, this immigrant engineer possessed an intuitive understanding that American pilots faced fundamentally different challenges than their European counterparts. While British fighters operated from bases mere minutes from combat, American aviators would fly hundreds of miles over enemy territory with no possibility of rescue if shot down. Speed and agility meant nothing if the pilot never made it home. Kartveli's philosophy crystallized during a train ride back from Wright Field in January 1940, after receiving the Army Air Corps' seemingly impossible requirements. 400 miles per hour at 25,000 feet, 850 caliber machine guns, armor protection, self-sealing fuel tanks, 315 gallons of fuel capacity. Every specification demanded size, weight, and power that conventional wisdom declared incompatible with fighter performance. As the New York countryside blurred past his window, Kartveli sketched the basic configuration that would become the P-47. A massive radial engine driving the largest single-engine fighter ever conceived. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp that formed the heart of Kartveli's creation generated 2,000 horsepower from 18 cylinders arranged in 2 rows. Unlike the liquid-cooled inline engines favored by European designers, the radial configuration offered inherent survivability. A single rifle bullet through the cooling system could down a Spitfire or Mustang, but the R-2800's air-cooled cylinders could absorb tremendous damage and continue operating. 400 pounds of steel armor plate protected the pilot, oil cooler, and engine accessories. The fuel system incorporated 305 gallons of gasoline in self-sealing tanks lined with rubber compounds that automatically sealed bullet holes. The first P-47s to reach combat in early 1943 vindicated neither the skeptics nor the believers. The massive fighters could climb to altitudes no German aircraft could match, 42,000 feet compared to 34,000 for the Focke-Wulf 190, but their initial combat radius barely reached the French coast. German pilots quickly adapted their tactics, avoiding the high-altitude P-47s and concentrating their attacks on bombers flying deep into Reich territory where the Thunderbolts could not follow. Republic test pilots had already discovered the P-47's most remarkable characteristic during dive tests over Long Island Sound. While European fighters approached their structural limits at 400 miles per hour in a vertical dive, the Thunderbolt could exceed 500 miles per hour without breaking apart. The sheer mass that made it sluggish in climbing and turning became a devastating advantage in high-speed pursuit. German pilots learned to their horror that diving away from a P-47, the standard escape maneuver against other Allied fighters, only played to the Thunderbolt's greatest strength. The statistical reality of air combat began shifting in ways that surprised even Kartveli. P-47 loss rate settled at 0.7 aircraft per 100 sorties compared to 1.2 for the celebrated P-51 Mustang and 1.8 for the twin-engine P-38 Lightning. German ace Heinrich Baer, whose aerial victories numbered over 200, would later observe with grudging respect that the P-47 could absorb an astounding amount of lead and keep flying. What appeared to be a liability, the aircraft's enormous size and weight, was revealing itself as a life-saving asset. By spring 1943, the 8th Air Force had begun to grasp the implications of Kartveli's design philosophy. The P-47 might not win classic dogfights through superior maneuverability, but it excelled at the kind of combat American pilots actually faced: high-altitude escort missions where superior climb rate and diving speed mattered more than turning radius. More importantly, it brought pilots home alive from encounters that would have been fatal in lighter aircraft. The transformation in thinking was neither immediate nor universal. Traditional fighter doctrine died hard, especially among pilots trained to value agility above all else. But mathematics possesses an inexorable logic that eventually overwhelms even the most entrenched prejudices. The P-47 was proving that sometimes the turtle could indeed beat the hare, provided the turtle was armored, armed, and powerful enough to survive the race. The engineering specifications that Republic Aviation submitted to the Army Air Corps in late 1941 read like a technical fantasy. The P-47C variant that began rolling off Long Island production lines carried an empty weight of 9,900 pounds, nearly double that of contemporary fighters. Fully loaded with fuel, ammunition, and pilot, the aircraft tipped the scales at 14,925 pounds. Traditional aerodynamic theory suggested such a machine would be incapable of combat maneuvering, yet Kartveli's team had solved the weight penalty through brute force power application. The Pratt & Whitney R-2821. Double Wasp represented the pinnacle of American radial engine development. 18 cylinders arranged in 2 precise rows generated maximum power through a carefully orchestrated ballet of fuel injection, ignition timing, and supercharger boost. At 25,000 feet, the altitude where most bomber escort missions occurred, the engine produced 1,800 horsepower through its General Electric turbo supercharger system. The turbo supercharger itself, mounted in the rear fuselage and connected to the engine through elaborate ducting, allowed the P-47 to maintain sea-level power output at altitudes where German fighters began losing performance. Republic's armament installation reflected American industrial philosophy, overwhelming firepower through superior manufacturing capability. 8 Browning Ensign II 50 caliber machine guns, 4 mounted in each wing, carried a total of 3,400 rounds of ammunition. The synchronized firing rate approached 100 rounds per second, delivering a weight of fire that could destroy enemy aircraft with brief bursts. Each 50 caliber projectile possessed sufficient energy to penetrate armor plate at combat ranges, while incendiary rounds could ignite fuel tanks and hydraulic systems with devastating effect. The protection systems that Kartveli's team integrated into the P-47 design represented a fundamental departure from European fighter philosophy. 400 pounds of hardened steel armor surrounded critical aircraft systems and the pilot compartment. The pilot seat incorporated a steel backrest capable of stopping 20-millimeter cannon shells, while additional armor plates protected the engine oil tank, reduction gearbox, and turbo supercharger. Bulletproof glass panels, each nearly 2 inches thick, shielded the windscreen and provided forward visibility without compromising protection. The fuel system embodied the most sophisticated survivability technology available to American designers. 305 gallons of aviation gasoline resided in multiple self-sealing tanks, distributed throughout the wing and fuselage. Each tank featured an inner rubber lining that expanded when punctured by bullets or shell fragments, automatically sealing holes up to 50 caliber diameter. Fire suppression systems could flood the tanks with carbon dioxide, while fuel selector valves allowed pilots to draw from undamaged tanks if others were compromised. The redundancy extended to oil systems, hydraulic circuits, and electrical networks, multiple pathways for every critical function. When the 56th Fighter Group arrived at King's Cliff, England, in January 1943, their P-47C aircraft represented the cutting edge of American fighter technology. Ground crews marveled at the complexity of systems packed into each aircraft. The turbo supercharger installation alone required more maintenance than entire British fighters, while the 8 machine guns demanded careful harmonization to ensure accurate fire convergence. Pilots discovered that managing the P-47 systems required a fundamentally different approach than flying conventional fighters. The aircraft's performance envelope revealed characteristics that defied traditional fighter doctrine. Maximum speed at optimum altitude reached 430 miles per hour, respectable but not exceptional by 1943 standards. Rate of climb, however, varied dramatically with altitude. Below 10,000 feet, the P-47 climbed sluggishly, easily outperformed by German fighters. Above 20,000 feet, where the turbo supercharger reached peak efficiency, the Thunderbolt could outclimb any Axis fighter in service. Service ceiling reached 42,000 feet, nearly 8,000 feet higher than the Focke-Wulf 190 that dominated European skies. Combat radius presented the P-47's most significant limitation during early operations. Internal fuel capacity provided range of 835 miles at economical cruise settings, but high-power combat maneuvering reduced operational radius to less than 200 miles from base. This limitation relegated P-47s to escort missions over occupied France and the Low Countries, while deeper penetration raids into Germany remained beyond their reach. German fighter commanders quickly recognized this tactical constraint and concentrated their forces beyond P-47 range, attacking bombers after the escorts turned back. The first combat victories validated Kartveli's design philosophy while exposing areas requiring improvement. On April 15, 1943, P-47s of the 4th Fighter Group scored their initial confirmed kills. 2 Focke-Wulf 190s destroyed during a sweep over the Pas-de-Calais. The engagement demonstrated the P-47's advantages in high-altitude combat, superior diving speed, devastating firepower, and immunity to battle damage that would cripple lighter fighters. German pilots reported that P-47 seemed capable of absorbing punishment that would destroy any other Allied fighter. Luftwaffe tactical assessments during summer 1943 reflected grudging respect for American engineering capabilities. Intelligence reports noted the P-47's exceptional ruggedness and firepower while dismissing its dogfighting ability as inferior to German types. This assessment proved partially accurate, but fundamentally misunderstood the P-47's intended role. Kartveli had never designed the Thunderbolt to win turning contests with Messerschmitts. Instead, he had created a fighter optimized for the specific mission American pilots faced, escorting bombers deep into enemy territory and bringing crews home alive. The statistical evidence accumulating through summer 1943 supported Kartveli's unconventional approach. P-47 squadrons reported loss rates significantly lower than other fighter types operating in the European theater. More importantly, aircraft that returned to base often displayed battle damage that would have proven fatal to conventional fighters. Mechanics counted bullet holes numbering in the dozens, cannon shell impacts and hydraulic system failures. Yet the pilots walked away to fight again. The flying bathtub was proving that sometimes survival mattered more than style. Second Lieutenant Robert Johnson had earned his reputation as a problem pilot well before his P-47 absorbed its first enemy bullet. The 22-year-old Oklahoman possessed the kind of steady nerves that farm work bred into young men. But his tendency to break formation and pursue individual targets frustrated squadron commanders who value discipline above initiative. Johnson flew with the 61st Fighter Squadron of the 56th Fighter Group, a unit that had arrived at Kingscliff in January 1943 with high expectations and untested aircraft. The early months of P-47 operations had produced mixed results that reflected both the aircraft's capabilities and its limitations. Pilots discovered that their massive mounts required different tactics than conventional fighters. The Thunderbolt's poor rate of climb below 20,000 feet made it vulnerable to surprise attacks by German fighters operating at medium altitudes. Conversely, its exceptional high-altitude performance and diving speed created opportunities for hit-and-run attacks that maximized the P-47's strengths while minimizing its weaknesses. Johnson's first serious encounter with enemy fire occurred during a sweep over Antwerp in May 1943. A 20mm cannon shell from a Focke-Wulf 190 penetrated his engine cowling, fragments peppering the cockpit and shredding his flight suit. Any other fighter aircraft would have shed pieces and plummeted earthward, but the P-47's massive radial engine continued operating on 17 cylinders while Johnson nursed the damaged aircraft back to England. The incident provided his first direct experience with the survivability that Kartveli had designed into every system. German tactical doctrine during spring 1943 reflected careful analysis of American fighter capabilities and limitations. Luftwaffe commanders recognized that P-47s posed minimal threat during bomber escort missions beyond their combat radius. Intelligence reports correctly identified the Thunderbolt's range limitation as its primary weakness, leading to a defensive strategy that concentrated fighter attacks on bombers after their escorts turned back. This tactical approach proved devastatingly effective through the summer of 1943, when 8th Air Force bomber losses reached unsustainable levels during unescorted portions of deep penetration raids. The mission briefing on June 26 began routinely enough. 48 P-47s from the 56th Fighter Group would rendezvous with returning Boeing B-17 Flying Fortresses near Forges-les-Eaux, approximately 50 miles northeast of Paris. The bombers had struck the Luftwaffe maintenance facility at Villers-Coublay earlier that afternoon and were limping homeward with battle damage and depleted ammunition. Intelligence reports indicated moderate enemy fighter activity in the area, but nothing beyond the normal hazards of escort duty over occupied France. Johnson's aircraft occupied the vulnerable tail position of the formation, a slot typically assigned to experienced pilots capable of defending themselves if separated from the group. His P-47C carried the standard load of ammunition and fuel, 850 rounds per gun for the wing-mounted 50 calibers, and sufficient gasoline for 3 hours of combat operations. The aircraft had accumulated nearly 100 combat hours since delivery, with maintenance records showing only routine repairs and component replacements. The rendezvous proceeded according to plan until 1850 hours, when 16 Focke-Wulf 190s from Jagerschwader 26 dove from altitude advantage. The German fighters had positioned themselves between the sun and the American formation, using classic fighter tactics that maximized concealment until the moment of attack. Johnson's P-47, flying protective cover at the rear of the bomber stream, became the primary target for the initial assault wave. The first indication of trouble came as 20mm cannon shells began impacting Johnson's aircraft with methodical precision. German gunnery training emphasized aimed fire over spray and pray tactics, and the attacking pilot demonstrated textbook marksmanship as his cannon shells walked through the P-47's fuselage. 21 shells found their mark in rapid succession, each detonating with the explosive force designed to destroy aircraft structures and disable critical systems. The cannon fire shattered Johnson's canopy into thousands of razor-sharp fragments that filled the cockpit like deadly snow. Hydraulic fluid under 3,000 pounds per square inch pressure sprayed from severed lines, coating the interior surfaces and blinding the pilot. Fire erupted from damaged electrical systems, licking at Johnson's boots and threatening to engulf the cockpit in flames. The acrid smell of burning insulation mixed with the metallic taste of blood as glass fragments cut his face and hands. Machine gun fire followed the cannon attack as the Focke-Wulf pilot closed range and opened fire with his twin 13mm machine guns. More than 200 bullets perforated the P-47 structure, punching through aluminum skin, control cables, and internal components. One bullet grazed Johnson's nose, destroying his oxygen mask and adding the copper taste of blood to the cocktail of aviation gasoline, hydraulic fluid, and smoke that filled his mouth and nostrils. The P-47 entered an uncontrolled spin as damaged control surfaces failed to respond to Johnson's desperate inputs. 25,000 feet became 20,000, then 15,000 as the 7-ton fighter corkscrewed toward the French countryside below. Johnson attempted to bail out, fighting with the damaged canopy that would open only 6 inches before jamming on its twisted tracks. His parachute snagged on the canopy frame, trapping him inside what had become a burning coffin spinning toward Earth at terminal velocity. At 10,000 feet, something miraculous occurred. The fire that had threatened to consume the cockpit suddenly extinguished itself, starved of oxygen by the P-47's violent gyrations. Johnson managed to recover from the spin and regain a semblance of controlled flight, though hydraulic fluid continued streaming from severed lines and the aircraft handled like a truck with flat tires. His radio was dead, his instruments were destroyed, and German fighters still prowled the surrounding airspace, but the Thunderbolt continued flying when any other fighter would have disintegrated. The long journey home would test every aspect of Kartvelli's design philosophy as Johnson's crippled P-47 limped across 300 miles of enemy territory with a Focke-Wulf pilot determined to finish what he had started. The Focke-Wulf pilot who had initiated the devastating attack on Johnson's P-47 possessed the tactical patience that separated veteran aircrew from inexperienced hunters. Rather than breaking away after his initial firing pass, the German fighter remained in pursuit of the crippled Thunderbolt as it began its desperate journey toward the English Channel. Intelligence reports had emphasized the importance of confirming kills against American heavy fighters, since damaged P-47s had demonstrated an alarming tendency to reach friendly territory despite catastrophic battle damage. Johnson's situational awareness had been reduced to the most primitive level of survival flying. Hydraulic fluid coating the interior of his shattered canopy limited forward visibility to occasional glimpses through clear spots in the oily film. The P-47's control responses felt mushy and unpredictable, requiring constant corrections to maintain level flight. Most critically, his fuel situation remained unknown since the fuel quantity gauges had been destroyed along with the rest of his instrument panel. He was flying blind across hostile territory in an aircraft that leaked vital fluids from dozens of puncture wounds. The pursuing Focke-Wulf maintained position approximately 500 yards behind and slightly above Johnson's aircraft, occasionally closing range to deliver precise bursts of machine gun fire. The German pilot's tactical approach reflected professional competence rather than aggressive pursuit. He was methodically expending his remaining ammunition to ensure the P-47's destruction while conserving enough fuel to return to base. Each firing pass added more bullet holes to the Thunderbolt's perforated structure without triggering the catastrophic structural failure that conventional wisdom suggested was inevitable. Aviation medical knowledge of 1943 offered little guidance for pilots flying extended missions while suffering from blood loss, smoke inhalation, and psychological shock. Johnson's survival depended entirely on the physiological reserves that 22 years of rural Oklahoma life had built into his constitution. The steady nerves that had allowed him to break formation and pursue individual targets now served a more fundamental purpose: maintaining consciousness and basic motor control while flying a dying aircraft across 300 miles of enemy territory. The P-47's structural integrity was being tested beyond any design specification that Republic Aviation had contemplated. 21 cannon shells had created holes large enough to insert a man's fist, while machine gun bullets had perforated control surfaces, fuel tanks, and load-bearing members throughout the airframe. Traditional aircraft construction relied on aluminum skin to carry structural loads in combination with internal framework. But the P-47's designers had incorporated redundant load paths that allowed the aircraft to survive damage that would have caused immediate structural failure in lighter fighters. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine continued operating despite multiple bullet strikes that had severed oil lines, damaged cylinder heads, and punctured the engine cowling in dozens of locations. The 18-cylinder radial configuration provided inherent survivability that liquid-cooled engines could not match. Individual cylinders could be destroyed without causing total power loss, while the air-cooled design eliminated the catastrophic vulnerability to coolant system damage that plagued inline engines. Johnson's engine was running roughly and losing power progressively, but it continued producing enough thrust to maintain forward momentum. The German pilot's ammunition supply was approaching exhaustion after 30 minutes of intermittent firing. Focke-Wulf 190s carried 450 rounds for each of their 4 20mm cannons and 900 rounds for each machine gun, sufficient for approximately 30 seconds of continuous fire. The extended pursuit of Johnson's P-47 had consumed most of this ammunition without achieving the definitive kill that Luftwaffe doctrine demanded. Each firing pass had produced visible hits and additional damage, yet the American fighter continued flying with mechanical persistence that defied aerodynamic logic. Johnson's navigation was being conducted through the most primitive methods available to aviators, With his compass destroyed and radio inoperative, he relied on dead reckoning based on estimated airspeed, elapsed time, and visual landmarks glimpsed through breaks in the hydraulic fluid coating his windscreen. The Channel coast lay approximately 200 miles west of his present position, but precise navigation was impossible under current conditions. His survival depended on maintaining a generally westward heading while hoping that fuel consumption had not exceeded the P-47's internal capacity. The psychological dimension of the running fight tested both pilots in fundamentally different ways. The German pilot faced the tactical challenge of completing a mission against an opponent who refused to conform to expected behavior patterns. His ammunition was nearly exhausted, his fuel was approaching minimum reserves for return flight, yet the American aircraft continued flying despite absorbing punishment that should have caused immediate destruction. Professional training emphasized mission completion, but practical considerations demanded disengagement before his own survival was compromised. Johnson's mental state had simplified to the basic equations of survival flying: maintain altitude, hold heading, monitor engine parameters through sound and vibration since instruments were inoperative. The normal complexities of aerial combat, radio communications, formation discipline, tactical decision-making had been stripped away by battle damage that reduced his situation to the most fundamental challenge in aviation: staying airborne long enough to reach safety. The final moments of the aerial duel approached as the German pilot made his tactical decision. His firing passes had expended over 200 rounds of machine gun ammunition against the P-47 structure without achieving decisive results. Fuel considerations demanded immediate disengagement if he intended to reach friendly territory before his engine quit. The American fighter was clearly doomed. No aircraft could survive such extensive damage. Yet it continued flying with mechanical stubbornness that commanded professional respect. The Focke-Wulf pilot's final action spoke to the warrior code that transcended national boundaries in aerial combat. Rather than attempting one last firing pass that might exhaust his fuel reserves, he pulled alongside Johnson's crippled P-47 and rocked his wings in the universal salute between fighter pilots. The gesture acknowledged courage in the face of certain death, while honoring an opponent who had fought with skill and determination. Then the German fighter peeled away toward the east, leaving Johnson alone with his dying aircraft and the distant promise of the English Channel. The white cliffs of Dover materialized through the hydraulic fluid, coating Johnson's windscreen like a mirage that gradually resolved into geographical reality. 2 hours and 45 minutes after the initial attack over France, his P-47 had somehow traversed 300 miles of hostile territory and crossed the English Channel despite battle damage that conventional wisdom declared unsurvivable. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine continued its labored operation, though oil pressure had dropped to barely measurable levels and cylinder head temperatures exceeded all normal operating parameters. RAF Manston Airfield appeared ahead, its emergency landing facilities designed specifically for damaged aircraft returning from combat operations over continental Europe. The control tower operators had already spotted Johnson's approaching Thunderbolt and recognized the telltale signs of severe battle damage: erratic flight path, visible structural damage, and the characteristic smoke trail of an engine operating beyond its design limits. Emergency crews positioned themselves along the runway, foam trucks and ambulances prepared for the catastrophic crash that seemed inevitable. Johnson's landing approach required every technique he had learned about flying damaged aircraft, plus several that he improvised during the final minutes of flight. The P-47's hydraulic system had lost all pressure, rendering the landing gear extension questionable and the flaps completely inoperative. Without flaps, his approach speed would be significantly higher than normal, while the questionable landing gear added the possibility of gear collapse upon touchdown. Most critically, His engine was beginning to miss badly as oil starvation took its toll on internal components. The Thunderbolt touched down on Manston's main runway at 130 miles per hour, approximately 20 miles per hour, faster than normal landing speed. The impact transmitted through the airframe like a controlled crash, testing structural connections that had already been weakened by cannon fire and machine gun bullets. Both main landing gear struts held despite visible battle damage, though the left tire immediately deflated from a bullet hole that had gone unnoticed during the extended flight home. Johnson fought to maintain directional control as the aircraft veered toward the runway edge before finally rolling to a stop near the intersection with the cross runway. Ground crews who reached the stationary P-47 first encountered a scene that challenged their understanding of aircraft survivability. The Thunderbolt's aluminum skin had been transformed into a metallic colander, with bullet holes and cannon shell impacts distributed across virtually every square foot of surface area. The engine cowling resembled Swiss cheese, while the cockpit area showed evidence of fire damage that should have proven fatal to any pilot. Hydraulic fluid, engine oil, and aviation gasoline dripped from numerous punctures, creating rainbow-colored puddles on the concrete runway. Emergency medical personnel found Johnson conscious but barely mobile. His flight suit soaked with blood, hydraulic fluid, and perspiration from the extended ordeal. Glass fragments from the shattered canopy had created dozens of superficial cuts on his face and hands, while burns on his legs testified to the cockpit fire that had nearly consumed him during the initial attack. The flight surgeon who examined him at the scene marveled that the pilot had remained conscious long enough to fly across the channel, much less execute a successful landing approach. The systematic damage assessment that followed Johnson's rescue required 3 days of detailed inspection by Republic Aviation Technical representatives and Royal Air Force maintenance specialists. Counting bullet holes proved more challenging than initially anticipated, since many had overlapped or been obscured by structural damage. The official tally recorded over 200 machine gun bullet impacts on the port side alone, with similar damage on the starboard side, bringing the total well above 400 individual penetrations. 2120 millimeter cannon shell impacts were identified and cataloged by location and estimated trajectory. Each had created damage equivalent to a small grenade explosion, yet none had struck a truly vital component that would have caused immediate aircraft loss. The engine had absorbed multiple hits without suffering catastrophic failure, while the fuel system had demonstrated the effectiveness of self-sealing tank technology despite numerous punctures. Most remarkably, the flight controls had remained functional despite severed cables and damaged control surfaces throughout the airframe. Republic Aviation's chief test pilot, who flew to Manston to examine the damaged aircraft personally, declared Johnson's P-47 a total constructive loss due to structural damage beyond economical repair. However, the technical intelligence value of examining an aircraft that had survived such punishment proved invaluable for future design improvements. Every bullet hole, every cannon shell impact, every system failure was photographed, measured, and analyzed to understand how Cartvelli's design philosophy had translated into practical survivability. The statistical implications of Johnson's survival began resonating through 8th Air Force headquarters within days of his emergency landing. Fighter command analysts recognized that any other Allied fighter aircraft would have been destroyed by a fraction of the battle damage that Johnson's P-47 had absorbed. The incident provided dramatic validation of design decisions that had been questioned by traditional fighter advocates, who valued agility over survivability. Johnson returned to combat operations 6 weeks later, flying a new P-47D that incorporated lessons learned from aircraft like his battle-damaged Thunderbolt. The replacement aircraft bore the name Lucky on its engine cowling. though Johnson's subsequent combat career would demonstrate that survival depended more on engineering excellence than random fortune. He eventually achieved 27 confirmed aerial victories while flying P-47s, becoming one of the war's leading American aces and a living testament to Kartvel's design philosophy. The broader implications of the June 26th incident influenced American fighter doctrine for the remainder of the European War. Statistical analysis demonstrated that P-47 loss rates remained consistently lower than other fighter types despite operating in the most dangerous combat environments. The aircraft that critics had dismissed as a flying bathtub was proving that bringing pilots home alive represented the ultimate measure of fighter aircraft effectiveness. German fighter pilots gradually developed grudging respect for P-47 durability as similar incidents accumulated throughout summer and fall 1943. Luftwaffe tactical reports began emphasizing the necessity of achieving decisive hits against American Thunderbolts, since damaged P-47s displayed an alarming tendency to reach friendly territory despite battle damage that would destroy other fighter types. Heinrich Baer's assessment that P-47s could absorb an astounding amount of lead became widely accepted within German fighter units as operational reality rather than propaganda exaggeration. Johnson's final words to the medical personnel who extracted him from his bullet-riddled cockpit captured the essence of what Republic aviation had achieved through Kartvel's revolutionary approach to fighter design. 21 20mm cannon shells and more than 200 machine gun bullets, he stated with characteristic understatement. No other fighter could have taken that punishment and kept flying. The flying bathtub had proven that when built right, bathtubs don't leak.